register, you can invite them to view it there. You've probably all noticed that your microphones have been muted. We had originally envisioned this event as more of a community conversation, but with the incredible response and the size of the audience, we've had to make it more like a webinar. We are opening the chat function so you can post questions for our panel as you are listening. And because of the size of our group, other attendees will not see what you post, and there will be no dialogue available in the chat area. So please send your comments directly to me, Amy Barron, in the drop-down menu of the chat. And we'll begin to take questions, we'll begin to ask questions that come in from the audience in about 45 minutes. I also want to draw your attention to 2 donation opportunities, which were in the email that was sent just before the meeting tonight. The first is for the New England Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization that fights to correct and prevent wrongful convictions. The second is for Sean Ellis to further his education. The Needham Diversity Initiative will be facilitating donations received on Sean's behalf, and all donations to NDI between now and Friday, December 18th will be provided directly to Sean's 529 account. We're placing the links to these 2 donation opportunities in the chat. And we will also send the links out in an email after this call. Okay, at this point, it is my great honor to introduce you to our panelists. Stephanie Roberts Hartung is a Needham resident and professor at the Northeastern University School of Law. She serves alongside Sean on the board of the New England Innocence Project. Stephanie's research and scholarship focus on wrongful convictions, mass incarceration, and criminal justice reform. Our special guest this evening is Mr. Sean K. Ellis, the subject of the documentary Trial 4. Sean is a community activist and frequent public speaker on wrongful conviction and criminal justice reform. Way back in the early 1980s, Sean attended Mitchell Elementary School here in Needham, which is the same elementary school my 2 teenage boys attended. I met Sean last year at the Needham Diversity Initiative's annual summit. After a small breakout session, Sean talked at length with me and my then 15-year-old son, Nico. Sean's warmth, candor, intelligence, and sincerity were immediately apparent. He described to us how he had done a lot of his own legal research in prison, and the sensitivity and patience he showed when explaining his situation to Nico was really touching. My family and I watched the series with great personal interest, and we're so honored to have Sean here tonight. So with great pleasure and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sean Ellis and Stephanie Roberts Hartung. Take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you, Amy and Gretchen, and thank you to the Needham Diversity Initiative for hosting this event tonight and for inviting me here to help facilitate this conversation with Sean. And as has been said, Sean has a close connection to the Needham community that dates back to his childhood at Mitchell, Pollard, and then later as a teenager at Needham High. And since his release and subsequent exoneration, Sean has been a frequent visitor and speaker in our community, most recently returning to speak to a group of Pollard middle schoolers last spring. And I know there are many of you here tonight who have had met Sean personally, as Amy described, and have made connections with him at some of these events over the years and have been personally moved by Sean's story. And I think the crowd here tonight is a testament to the impact of how powerful his story is, and especially as told in the Netflix series Trial 4. So I'm going to say a few words about Sean and about the series before turning over to a conversation with Sean. So it's clear that Trial 4 has struck a chord with viewers on so many levels. First, it has shined a light on the inconceivable injustice that Sean suffered at the hands of the fundamentally broken criminal legal system in Massachusetts. The story told in the series is compelling in large part because of the unimaginable strength and character of its main subject, Sean Ellis. As viewers, our natural reaction to his plight is profound disbelief and outrage. Yet amazingly, at the center of the story is Sean himself, who has somehow emerged from this ordeal free of bitterness or anger at any particular person. Instead, Sean's resolve and strength are inspirational. His calm, humility, and grace in the face of bigotry and injustice are at the heart of the series and its impact on viewers. And I do want to take a minute just to acknowledge the fact that Sean has been willing in many ways to relive this profound pain and suffering he endured. And I know that he does so in the interest of exposing the injustice of his case and bringing about change in a broken system. But we should not forget the pain involved in doing so as well. Not many of us are asked to publicly relive the most difficult and challenging experiences of our life over and over again. And so first, I want to thank and acknowledge Sean for his willingness to share with us today. Beyond Sean's personal story, Trial 4 has exposed the broader issue of wrongful convictions in our criminal system and how extraordinarily difficult they are to address and correct. We see in Sean's case the Herculean task of unraveling and correcting his wrongful conviction. And this is true in spite of the discovery of a pattern of misconduct and corruption on the part of both the police detective victim and the investigating officers who developed the case against Sean. Consider for a moment all of the forces of support that Sean had following his conviction. He had a loving and supportive family and community that stood by him while he was incarcerated, including his beautiful mother, Jackie, and sister, Sade, who are here tonight. Sean also had his own intellect, his tireless self-advocacy, and motivation to educate himself while incarcerated, ultimately earning a paralegal certificate and actively participating in his own defense, as we see in the series. There was also a Globe Spotlight team who uncovered the police corruption in BPD just after Sean's conviction. And Sean had some of the most talented, fearless, and dogged criminal defense attorneys in Boston, Rose Capiccio and Jaleese McDonough, working on his case. Finally, he had the ongoing support of former Needham resident and longtime friend Elaine Murphy, who devoted years of her adult life to proving Sean's innocence. Yet even with all of these supports on his side, it took 2 decades to get Sean's conviction overturned. And it wasn't until this time last year, several years after Sean's release, that the DA's office and BPD reluctantly dismissed his case, continuing even then to deny Sean's factual innocence. What's shameful is that in spite of this external and indisputable evidence of police misconduct, including tampering with evidence, coercing witnesses, lying and stealing, for years, the Suffolk County DA's office and Boston Police Department refused to look honestly and critically at the case. In fact, when Sean's conviction was first vacated in 2015 in the opening scene of the series with Judge Ball, and Sean was subsequently released, the DA's office appealed the decision to the Supreme Judicial Court, the highest court in Massachusetts. And later, even when the SJC ruled that justice was not done in Sean's case, affirming the lower court's decision, the DA at the time still threatened to retry Sean's case for a 4th time. And it was not until a year ago, on the eve of the tenure of Rachel Rollins, who won the DA election in Suffolk County on a progressive platform and spoke openly about the issues raised in Sean's case, that the DA's office finally dismissed the charges against Sean just weeks before Rollins took office. Sean's story exposes the forces that operate to hold a wrongful conviction in place, especially when it involves a Black man. And Sean's case does not exist in a vacuum. In Boston alone, There have been over 30 proven exonerations, with that number increasing on a monthly basis. The newest Boston exoneration, James Watson, occurred just a few weeks ago. And of these exonerations, 2/3 involve police misconduct among BPD, and nearly 80% of the men exonerated are Black. Sean's story is one of many. And we know that of these 30 plus cases where exonerations have occurred in Boston alone, that these are just the tip of the iceberg. The New England Innocence Project, or NEIP, where Sean and I work together on the Board of Trustees, fields letters, applications, and requests for assistance from incarcerated people maintaining their innocence every week. NEIP has dozens of open cases in various stages of the review, investigation, and litigation process, a process that, as we saw in Trial 4, takes years, if not decades in some cases. When Sean left prison, he joined a community of exonerees, both in the Boston area and nationally, as you saw in the series, who support each other and work to advocate for change in the system. And Sean knows better than anyone that when he was released from prison, he left behind other innocent people serving out their sentences, struggling to find ways to overturn their convictions. NEIP's work is nowhere near done. And I want to acknowledge that one of Sean's attorneys, Jaleese McDonough, is here with us tonight. And I can't help bragging for a minute because Jaleese is one of my former students. So I am particularly proud of her tireless advocacy on Sean's behalf. And also with us tonight is Elaine Murphy, who has been an ardent supporter of Sean over the years and whose role in the case is highlighted in the Trial 4 series. Finally, I think Trial 4 resonates with viewers for another reason as well. The series was released at a critical moment on the heels of an American reckoning with racial injustice and the historic role of policing. In the months since the tragic police killing of George Floyd, there's been a renewed public conversation about structural racism and the need for dramatic police reform. As Sean's story illustrates, the entrenched culture of racism, secrecy, and cover-up in the Boston Police Department is not just a historic relic, but is alive and well today. Although the two lead investigators who developed the case against Sean have been indicted and served time in federal prison for corruption, as we see in the series, there are still members of the BPD brass who maintain that the investigation and prosecution of Sean's case were, quote, as pure as the new snow. And just this week in the Boston Globe, we've seen reports of ongoing cover-ups within BPD and officers who commit repeated criminal acts who are able to retire with no consequences and with their pensions fully intact. And in Massachusetts, a police bill sits on the governor's desk, having emerged after months of closed-door discussions in the face of significant police resistance and with not a single Republican vote in support. As Sean's story reveals, there is an urgent need to address and reform modern policing in meaningful ways. So with that, I want to start the conversation with Sean, the person we all came here to hear from. So Sean, first of all, the Netflix series Trial 4 has been hugely popular since its release. So my first question is, how have you found the series? I know you were followed by film crew for many years. And so how have you enjoyed watching it? And what kind of response have you had from others? And how has it impacted your life?
Hi, Stephanie. And I want to say, thank you to everybody who's in attendance. And to get to your question, the series has been extremely hard for me to watch. The first time that I watched it, I sat with and dealt with a lot of different emotions in terms of the pain and the fear that I experienced going through that time. But the outshow of support that I've gotten from all over the world, from areas such as South Africa, Asia, the Netherlands, Switzerland. There's just been an overwhelming show of support. There's been people that have sent me emails that have been in my inbox on social media, just really speaking to the courage that was actually shown and not accepting a guilty plea for the crime that I didn't commit. There was also, a show of, strength of just believing in myself and pushing forward against what appeared to be, all odds.
Thank you, Sean. I think one of the things that's most powerful about the series is that it exposes the pain of your experience at the hands of the criminal system. And even though, as viewers, we feel this sense of outrage and disbelief, we see you, who is this, calm, measured, strong person at the center of it all. And since your release, you've been engaged in an array of activities and reform efforts as a community activist. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you find your strength, your incredible strength. And if you could talk a little bit about some of the projects that you've been involved in since your release.
Yes. And before I do, I just want to, say hello to my attorney, Rosemary Scapicio. She's actually present as well. And anytime that her and I are in proximity to one another, I always have to acknowledge her. And so, I just definitely want to say hello to her. But so to speak to the strength, I definitely have a relationship to a higher power. It doesn't matter what somebody calls them, if they call him Jesus Christ, if they call him Jehovah, if they call him Allah. It doesn't matter what terminology that you want to put on the higher power. I definitely have a relationship to a higher power. But one of the things early on that my mom said to me was that she knows that I didn't commit the crime. And me, as a student of the Needham public school system, education was big on my mom's radar. And I remember one of the earlier times that I had called home, and my mom had said to me, she said, "Sean, I don't have the law books here. And if I had the law books here, that I would do what I have to do in order to get you home, because I know that you didn't do what they're saying that you did." But she went on to say that I had the law books where I was at, which was in prison. And she kind of put the responsibility on my shoulders to do what I had to do as far as getting to the library and learn the law in order to be able to advocate for myself, which is really how I ended up reaching out to Rosemary and Ellis for representation. And what would you have a question, Stephanie?
And so I was also going to ask you about what you're involved in now since your release, your work with the Exoneree Network.
Yes.
I know you've been involved in enfranchisement with incarcerated people and any other projects you wanted to talk about. And also thank you for coming, and welcome to Rosemary. I did not realize you were going to be joining us. So it's wonderful to have you, and I hope you'll chime in with any comments that you have. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, so since being home, one of the first things that I did in terms of my judicial advocacy was connected with the New England Innocence Project. And there's organizations called Running for Innocence that's associated with the New England Innocence Project as well. And then I happened to be brought on to the board of trustees as a board member. And being part of the board, I was able to see from the work of the board, as well as from my standpoint as an exoneree, that there was additional work that needed to be done in terms of resources that was extended to exonerees once getting out of prison. And so what myself and a couple of other exonerees did was, begin a conversation with the people at NEEB in terms of developing what we now call the exoneree network. And part of the work of the network is to try to ascertain resources and kind of streamline some of the difficulties that exonerees have getting out of prison. Because in large part, when we're released from prison, the doors just open and we're pushed out or let out and essentially told to survive. Some of the other work that I'm involved in is part of the Ministry of Justice, which falls under the banner of the Nation of Islam. And part of what that work does is to amass the different organizations that are working in silos and try to bring everybody together to have a greater impact in the work being done towards criminal justice and social justice reform.
Great. You mentioned, Sean, the particular challenges of exonerees who are released from prison, and even as compared to people who are released who aren't exonerated, who have a series of supports through parole and whatnot. Exonerees have none of that. Can you talk a little bit about just what it's like getting out into the world after being incarcerated for, in your case, more than 2 decades, what that adjustment is like?
Yes, well, is my circumstances they weren't the norm, because I had the support of my family when I came home, my mom, and in particular my baby sister Sade, but along with them I had the support of the Murphys. But it's what I've heard from people who have gotten out of prison, and what I've witnessed from people who have gotten out of prison and have little to no support. They have problems in terms of putting money in their pocket, and being able to get very essentials such as hygiene, and while there's the EBT that most exonerees getting out of prison that allows them to get food. They don't have the money to get from point A to point B in terms of going for job interviews, in terms of getting from where they live at to the registry to try to get the license or an ID, or to get to City Hall to get a birth certificate. There's issues involving housing, which was a big issue for me. I think before we was able to figure out where I was gonna live at, my family had already raised, with the help of the community, the money that I was released on bail. So I had bail money, but nothing, but where I was gonna live was kind of still up in the air. And that was because I had been convicted for 22 years, accused of a crime that I didn't commit. And really nobody wanted to kind of take me into the housing. So we had a housing issue as well that we had to deal with.
So what about, Sean, I've seen the particular bond that you share with other exonerees, both in Boston and nationally. And what do you think is the particular support that exonerees derive from each other?
So when I see another exoneree or an exoneree sees me, there's the immediate relation that I can identify with what you've been through. It's like to go from living life on the street to being in handcuffs and incarcerated for any period of any number of days, months, or years. There's a special bond that we all have, and it's just based on the relatability and having come through something more, something greater than just, the typical struggle.
So there's a telling moment in the Netflix series when the Charles Stewart case gets discussed, the infamous Boston case where a white man claimed that a Black man had attacked and killed his wife in the early 1990s. And later, police rounded up Black men in Boston, ultimately arrested and charged a man before it was discovered that Charles Stewart himself was responsible for killing his own wife. And police officers in the series are commenting on the case and expressing a kind of, incredulousness or disbelief that this white man could possibly have killed his pregnant wife. Yet these same officers seem to have no trouble believing that you, a young Black teenager with no history of violence, no criminal record, would be capable of and willing to shoot a Boston police detective in an execution style murder for the sole purpose of having a trophy as the gun. So I want to ask you about what assumptions about Black men and criminality are at play here, and what role do you think race played in the police initially targeting you and as a suspect, and ultimately steering the investigation toward you and pursuing a conviction at all costs?
Yeah, so in answering your question, Stephanie, we have to go back. We have to go back to slavery. And I know that there is a disposition that slavery happened a long time ago and that Black people need to, get over it and move on. But when we speak about the criminality portion, it's there was a people that was put in bondage and basically told to remain exist. And whenever a member of that race tried to get out of bondage and ran away, they were sought after, and the people that sought after them at that time were known as slave catchers. And the evolution of slave catchers evolved into the police. And so the criminality that is associated with Black people have been associated with Black people since the induction of slavery, and that has just continued on throughout the years. And when we get into the 90s, and even before the 90s, it's like you have things such as the slave codes and convict leasing, and all things to keep Black people relegated within the system, so that the system can kind of feed on them and criminalize them. That right there continued on into the 80s and 90s, where the supposed criminality of Black people was now being portrayed through Hollywood with movies such as Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society. We've seen, as Michelle Alexander speaks about in her book, The New Jim Crow, on the 10 o'clock news at night, we hear about crack cocaine, and right after crack cocaine, we see imageries of Black and brown people. And so the relationship regarding the policing of the Black and brown community didn't just, begin in the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s. It began when we were brought to this country and placed in bondage and was sought after and brought back into the same conditions. Anytime that we tried to, gain any means of freedom.
So it's interesting, this event is sponsored by the Needham Diversity Initiative, and a good part of this audience, as has been discussed, are likely Needham residents. And so many in this crowd, enjoy the privilege of living in an affluent and predominantly white suburb, and are comfortable in the knowledge that our own teenagers who might break the law either by vehicle violations, underage drinking, vaping, marijuana use, or what have you, will, with very few exceptions, be shielded from the criminal process, from arrest and prosecution. And instead, our children are presumed to be good kids who might have made a mistake or made a bad choice. And it wouldn't be unusual for an affluent Needham resident to get a friendly call from police to have a discussion rather than initiating a prosecution. So by contrast, in over-policed communities like Dorchester, where you partially grew up, not too far from here, Black teenagers and their parents don't enjoy those same privileges. So Sean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experiences of bridging the gap between these two communities and how you experienced policing in each as a Black teenager.
Yes. Yeah, my experience in Needham, for for all intents and purposes, allowed me to see the two worlds, the white or the wealthy world, and the Black or the poverty-stricken world. And it's I had the opportunity of hanging out in Needham, not just as a young child, but even into my teenage years. And I attended some parties in Needham, as a high school student, and there was times that things happened at those parties. Guys got into a fight or girls got into a fight, and it was hardly ever a situation where the police was called. But in the rare moments where the police was called, it wasn't like 50 police cars showing up for a little one-on-one fight. It was maybe one or two cruisers showing up, and there was really, in terms of dealing with the problem that they was called for, kind of like a separation of the people with the issues. I can say in no uncertain terms did I ever see anybody that had an altercation when I was going to school in Needham be arrested. That scenario changes when I speak about what's going on in the Black and brown communities. Is I've seen people in the Black and brown communities get arrested for having a mere fist fight. And so when we speak about the policing and the policing relationship, one thing that is kind of obvious to me when I look at it is that in the Needham community, the police that are placed in that community look like the people from that community. But now when you come into the inner city, the overwhelming majority of people that police the Black and brown communities in the inner city don't look like the people that they're policing. And so now when we've been socialized into a anti-Black belief, or when we've been socialized into like a Black hysteria, is that heightens or inflames how those communities are policed. So now when you have a one-on-one fight in the Black community, there's 50 police cars that show up rather than the one or two police cars that show up in the suburban neighborhoods.
And so what was the level of trust you had in police as a young Black teenager, especially once you were back going to school in Dorchester after leaving Needham High?
Well, I think culturally, within the Black and brown community, and it's not just my take, but culturally, there is a huge lack of distrust between the citizens within the Black and brown communities that they have towards the police. But that, I think part of that goes into the psychology of that I spoken about a little while ago, when we look at like the runaway slaves and we see the wanted poster of the runaway slave. There really hasn't been a time that I'm aware of through our history where there's really been a pro-social type of relationship between how the Black and brown communities are policed. You know what I mean? So.
Okay, I'm sure this is a topic we'll come back to during the Q&A with the audience. I want to turn to a different topic for the moment. In the Netflix series, there's a moving scene, and I think it's in the last episode when you speak at the Moth Storytelling Hour at the Innocence Network conference. And I was fortunate to be there in person and remember how moving it was. And you eloquently reflect on the many strong women in your life who had such an influence on you. Your beautiful mother, your attorneys, Rose and Jaleese, Elaine Murphy, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the influences of these women in your life and the support they provided for you during your incarceration and as you fought to overturn your conviction.
Yeah, my mom, and I like to kind of deal with my mom last because the way that I process it, it's like she holds everything up, but my mom has really been an avid supporter since day one. Going way back to before I even got arrested. She asked me what was going on, and I told her I didn't know what was going on. I told her I didn't know why I was being followed or harassed. And she's been by my side basically since day one. And then Elaine has been a support to my mom as well, and myself. I remember as the years passed, I would get cards throughout the years, saying something along the lines of maybe this is the year, and so it was those things that were able to keep me going. And then there's Rosemary and Jaleese, and it's like there's so much that I can say about those relationships. I remember with Rosemary as well, her saying things to me like, I know you want me to hurry up and file, but there's still more work that needs to be done. And her going about that work, and I remember her just breathing life into me and breathing strength into me. And then Jaleese was one of the people that I would often speak to whenever I called the office, and I had questions like legal questions or just wanted an update on where things were going. So my relationship with those two go beyond just legal representation is really they take the position that they want to see me grow and be successful on a personal level now that I'm out of prison. But their legal advocacy is second to none as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on all fronts. I know there are so many people who have questions for you, and we want to leave plenty of time to get to them. Before I turn it back to Amy and the Q&A from the chat, though, I previously mentioned the police reform bill that's currently pending. And I know we have our State Senator Becca Rausch here tonight. So Becca, we're wondering if you would say a few words about the bill, its history, and your opinion of its efficacy. I know there are a lot of differing opinions about whether it goes far enough. And I think, Ramin, she'll need to be unmuted. Let's give you 1 minute. Ramin, are you able to unmute Senator Becca Rausch?
Yes, I'm trying to find her in the list. I'm sorry.
Okay, I can see her at the top of my screen, but I'm not sure.
I will find her shortly.
Okay, we'll give her a minute to get unmuted. Sean, do you want to speak about the police reform bill or any other thoughts you have on police reform before we get to Becca?
Yeah. Before I get to the police reform bill, some of the things that I've been working on that I think is extremely important is the abolition of life without parole. That's something that at one point Massachusetts had the the death penalty, and that was abolished in place of life without parole. But I think that my case and the shortcomings of my case really speak to the cruelty of the life without parole, because the reality is that if I didn't have Rosemary and Ellis as attorneys, the chances are more likely than not that I would still be in prison and on my way towards death. And so not just because the system itself is not infallible, but because there are systemic things that I think we're trying to address in the police bill, which I believe is grossly inadequate and doesn't really cover enough, that we need to be moving towards an abolition of life without parole, and really in favor of giving somebody a 15 to year life sentence, which doesn't necessarily guarantee their release, but it guarantees the opportunity to see the parole board after a 15-year period. And if we have a Department of Corrections and we believe in rehabilitation, it's kind of like, all right, sentence people to go and do time, and then I'll allow the system to work in the way that it was intended to work. And so, that's some of the stuff that I wanted to touch on, but I see the senator here ready to go. And so.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Senator Roush?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you this evening. Thank you so much for the invite. It really is an honor. And Sean, thank you so much for giving voice to the story of, to your story and to the stories of so many other people who are trying to fight the same fight that you have fought and won. I will talk about the life without parole bill, because that was filed this session. And so I want to thank you for raising that. I am State Senator Becca Roush. I was just reelected to my second term in the Senate. I do live here in Needham, and I'm very proud to be a Needhamite, particularly on nights like tonight. And I want to thank everyone for gathering here, hundreds of people gathering here virtually to discuss racial justice and the critically needed reforms to our broken criminal justice system. Thanks in particular, of course, to Sean, to Ellis, to Stephanie, to Elaine and Rosemary, and Amy and Gretchen and Ramin from NDI for making tonight happen and for joining us tonight to share your stories and insights, and also for your advocacy more broadly. Local conversations like this are so critical and so important. When we say Black Lives Matter, we really must commit to learning, to unlearning, and to advocating. This is really a collective duty on all of us to advocate for the safety and well-being of not just our Black and brown neighbors, but also to work to dismantle and chip away at deeply systemic racism, and in particular anti-Black racism statewide, nationally, and globally. So police reform, the legislature has just passed and sent to the governor's desk a police reform and racial justice bill. This has been a really crucial year for police reform, because for years before this, this issue has really been untouchable in American politics, including Massachusetts, even though we have this kind of false reputation of being a progressive state. We're not. But this year was different for deeply tragic reasons, right? The deaths, murders of Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and George Floyd. But after those murders, people all across the Commonwealth, including here in Needham, just poured out into the streets in overwhelming numbers to reinvigorate the fight against police brutality and for police accountability within our Commonwealth. So we're now 6 years after the beginning of the BLM movement, and the Massachusetts legislature has finally responded. And the House and the Senate have both passed versions of police reform back in July. The bill then went to something called a conference committee where they try to resolve the differences. The Senate iteration by many measures was stronger than the House iteration of the bill, though there were a number of provisions in the House iteration, particularly around chokeholds and no-knock warrants, that were stronger than the Senate iteration of the bill. And many of those strong provisions were actually maintained. They survived conference, as we would say. The conference process was 4 months long. It's a really long process, and the election happened in the middle of that. And I am proud of the final product that came out that we passed and sent to the governor's desk just, I think it was last week, but it's COVID, so, time is a little funky. So the bill is now on the governor's desk, and all he needs to do is sign it, and it will become law. And wouldn't that be great? And I also want to be quite clear that particularly at this stage of the game, right, it is Tuesday, December 8th. I believe he has until this Friday to make a decision as to what he wants to do with the bill. He basically has 3 options: sign it, which means the bill immediately becomes law; veto it, which means it comes back down to the House and Senate for votes to overturn a veto, which the Senate does have, but the House does not have. Right, the Senate passed the bill with a veto-proof majority, but the House is quite far from the 2/3 vote required to overturn a veto, or override, a veto. And the third option is to send it back with changes. And because of the timing, that's effectively going to kill the bill as well, I fear, because it's now December 8th, Friday is the 11th. Anything that comes back with a proposed change would need to go back to the floors of the House and the Senate for further debate. And that could take a very long time indeed. And then we'd need to send anything back again to the governor for his signature, which he may or may not provide at that stage of the game. So I urge each and every one of you to take 3 minutes and send Governor Baker an email, or call him on the phone, or tweet at him, or whatever method you choose. I would suggest that postal mail is perhaps the least effective, just because most people are not in the State House right now. Most people are trying to work remotely. But pick a digital method of communication or a telephonic one, anyone you like, and urge him to sign this bill. And it does, again, have many strong provisions, serious limitations on the use of force, a duty to intervene in the case of an officer observing another officer using excessive force. The central tenet of the bill that actually both police and the governor and the legislature have been working for is this police accountability and oversight system. It's often called a POST system, which standardizes the certification requirements and also decertification of bad actors on the force. That POST board here in Massachusetts will be civilian-led. There's a 6-3 majority of civilians, right, non-officers on that board, with the authority and the power to not only investigate allegations of wrongdoing, but also to decertify police officers. And a decertification will prohibit that person from serving on any force in the rest of the state, or even entering the police academy. So that is quite significant, and puts Massachusetts in a position of leadership in the nation. And for anyone who has been decertified, qualified immunity will not apply for that decertified police officer. So is this bill everything that we hope it would be? No, we had really strong qualified immunity provisions to restore the doctrine of qualified immunity to its original intent and stop protecting really egregious cases of misconduct. That did pass in the Senate. By a veto-proof majority that did not survive conference. There was a robust provision in the Senate iteration of the bill that included really significant racial profiling data collection, analysis, and publication. In fact, that's something the Senate has now passed twice, because we also passed it in the hands-free driving bill earlier this term. That also got left on the conference committee cutting room floor. Is that disappointing? Absolutely. Is this
I'm
bill
sorry,
still-
Becca. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We appreciate all your insights about the bill so much. Thank you for sharing them. I realize we only have about 25 minutes and we have hundreds of questions for Sean. So I want to make
So
sure
sorry.
we get to all of those. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you to field the questions from the chat.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you all for that great conversation. As you can imagine, with so many people, there are quite a few questions have come in. I will do my best to ask as many of them as we can get to. And I wanted to kick it off just by asking, a lot of people are asking, what can we do? Are there things we can do in, obviously, calling or reaching out to the governor of Massachusetts for those of us who live in Massachusetts to support the bill. And we can try to send out more information in a follow-up email about that as well. But Stephanie, Sean, anyone, what are some other things that we can do?
So I'll take the first crack at that if you don't mind. Is we often vote elected officials into office, and we typically let them do what they do, and we don't really show much interest into them until either something big happens or they come back up for re-election. And so we heard the senator speak about qualified immunity, and I know that there was some desire to get qualified immunity taken off of the table when it comes to people that work in law enforcement being protected from wrongdoing, like from being protected from being held accountable for wrongdoing. So, like, say in my situation, in my case, qualified immunity would protect officers such as Sarah Robinson and Brazel, would protect officers such as Keela and McNally for being held accountable on a personal level for the things that they did wrong. In my case, the things that they did wrong. In other cases, from being held accountable. So essentially, the citizen or the taxpayer is held accountable for the wrongdoing of the police rather than the police being held accountable. So one of the things that can be done is to reach out to your local representatives and kind of tell them what your position is on the issues that are most relevant to you, so that they can be a real advocate while they're in City Hall or the State House, or ultimately the voting citizen can hold them accountable come re-election again.
And I'll just quickly add on a broader scale, in addition to, donate to Sean's 529 so he can go become a lawyer or whatever it is that he wants to do with his education. That's my own bias, but support NEEP to help other individuals who are fighting for their freedom, who are wrongly convicted. And then more broadly for this audience, just recognize that structural racism isn't going to get legislated away. It's a matter of changing hearts and minds over a very, very long time. And so all of us, many of us were just beginning the work, and I would just encourage you to read and educate yourself and start to understand that the structural racism that, oppressed Sean and led to his wrongful conviction they're the very same systems that have advantaged many of us who are here. And that's a hard thing to admit and to recognize, but I think we all need to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. People are clamoring to hear from Rosemary. Do you feel like saying a few words, Rosemary?
I'm muted. I'm still muted.
No, you're not.
I think you're, if you
I'm
don't
muted.
already know.
Oh, yeah, I'm unmuted.
I think you're going to have a huge following after this,
Good
if you
God,
don't
Rosemary,
already.
I can mute you. I don't think it was
Thank-
possible.
Thank you. So what I want to say about Sean is Jaleesa and I were privileged to represent him, first of all. He was a very easy client to deal with. If we told him he had to wait, he waited. If we told him we didn't have information, he understood. There were certainly times of frustration, but he understood the process because he educated himself about that process. And he understood that we had been fighting the Boston Police Department, at least I have, and Jaleesa for the time period that she's worked with me for the last 9 years, on almost every single case that we deal with. The level of distrust between the criminal defense bar and the Boston Police Department is just stunning, because we don't get the information that we need. And no one is held accountable for the fact that they don't disclose this information. If for anyone who's watched trial 4, you would think that after something like this has happened and after we've exposed all of the shortcomings of the Boston Police Department, that there would be a clamoring for change. There would be a need to evaluate how and why this happened and to ensure it doesn't happen again. And not only was that not the reaction of the Boston Police Department, but I think if you watch trial 4, you saw what their reaction was. They're still in denial, even after all these years, even after everything that we were able to present to them, even after a Superior Court judge and 7 judges of the SJC agreed with us that Sean didn't get a fair trial. They still sit there and say there was nothing wrong. Rosemary just made this up. She's looking for a payday. Those things couldn't be further from the truth. But they encompass and they embody so much of what's wrong with the Boston Police Department. And until there's some real structural change there, they understand, or at least they begin to understand what the problems were here and how it happened. I mean, they took this 19-year-old kid who had no record, had never been in trouble before in his life, and they turned him into a cop killer. And they did it understanding what was happening. And the idea that they could get away with it, it never crossed their mind that they couldn't. Never crossed their mind that they couldn't, because he was 19, he was poor, he was Black, he fit the profile of the usual suspect. And that's why they got away with it. That's exactly why they got away with it. And I think there is a need for change from top to bottom in the Boston Police Department, and for real accountability and transparency in the way that these officers are handled after we've been able to disclose all of the things that they did. And if you think about it now, I think it's bizarre that we've brought to light all of these things and still there's no investigation. There are other people's cases that Sarah and Robinson, Brazel, Keela, McNeely, they all worked on. And we know they worked on those cases, and no one's looking into them to say, wait a minute, if they did this to Sean, could they have done it to somebody else? And that's, what I think, and Jaleesa thinks is the real tragedy of what's happening here, is that we were hopeful that we would start a conversation and that they would be open to the possibility of change. And instead, they're still in denial. And I think the fact that they're still in denial is a problem of systemic racism. I think that's where it comes from. They put their blinders on and they say, there's nothing wrong with this investigation. It was a great investigation. Anyone who says it was not a great investigation is lying. And it's crazy. It was part of the documentary where, Rachel Rollins had been saying if she took office, she might look into Sean's case and might do something with it. And the reaction of the Boston police was that would be horrible and it'd be crazy for morale and, it would be disastrous. And then a white district attorney who happens to be an interim district attorney ends up dismissing Sean's case and saying he was still guilty. And there wasn't the pandemonium that they had expected when the Black DA was going to dismiss the case. It's so systemic within the Boston Police Department that there needs to be a real house cleaning there, or things are going to keep getting worse. Sean is not the only innocent person who sits in jail right now waiting for someone to try and save him. There are, I think, thousands of Seans sitting out there. If you looked at the way that Keeler, Sarah Robinson, and Brazel set up these people that they thought were drug dealers, and they just, without any qualms at all, put 200 grams of cocaine on this kid who had no involvement in the criminal justice system at all, because he happened to be a brown-skinned kid. And that was the way they did business, and they knew they could get away with it. And they've never, ever been prosecuted for it. They've never been investigated for it. Nobody's ever held them accountable for it. They kidnapped that guy. They dragged him around. They threatened him. They broke into his house, and they walk around free. And here's Sean serving 22 years for a crime he didn't commit. There needs to be accountability.
Yes,
And
absolutely. Oh, Sean, go
yeah,
ahead.
so no, we just to piggyback off of what Rosemary said. I know a case personally. I know several cases, but I'll speak about one personally. A case of a guy by the name of Ricky McGee, who the detective killer was involved in this case, and there was an affidavit that was submitted by a guy saying that he was going to testify on behalf of Ricky, and he was interrupted and brought into a small room by Detective Keeler and threatened to not testify. And so I just feel as though it was important to bring that into the conversation to kind of to highlight the fact that it isn't just what happened in Sean Ellis's case. What Rosemary is speaking about is in fact an epidemic that nobody's really talking about and nobody's doing anything to address.
So in terms of what everyone that's on the Zoom call can do to help, you can support progressive district attorneys. You can support the New England Innocence Project. You can make calls to Commissioner Gross, who thinks this is okay, and say, I demand an investigation. Why isn't anyone investigating? Unless he gets that type of public pressure, and especially from people who are wealthy and have some pull, he's not going to change. I mean, you saw him get on the news report in Sean's case and say, we know he did it, we just can't prove it. And that was, just such a slap in the face to everything we had accomplished as far as Sean is concerned. And no one questioned him. No one said, what do you mean you think he did it? Based on what you think he did it? And he just made the statement and walked away like, please pass the butter. But I think if people start pressuring him to investigate these cops, start pressuring him to really look into why it is that they aren't being in any way disciplined for not just breaking the rules of being a police officer, but they're actually conducting criminal activity and not being prosecuted and being protected instead by the commissioner of the police department, who says, we're all in this together, and we stand by this thin blue line, and as far as we're concerned, Sean got away with murder, and that's just bullshit.
So a question has come in about the history of the police being embedded in slavery and segregation. And the question is for you, Sean, about whether you think the ultimate goal of reform should be total defunding and abolition of the police.
Well, that would be a great goal, to have a society where police is not needed. But realistically speaking, I think that we live in a society where there is crime, and so where there's crime, there needs to be punishment, or there needs to be some type of dealing with that punishment. But I think what the issue is, and what the hope for me is to re-envision how the criminal justice system works. And so where the criminal justice system is not enacting repeated trauma. When I was incarcerated, I was part of a youth counseling program called Second Thoughts. And what we did was dealt with misguided youth and kind of position ourselves as a crystal ball to, if they make the wrong decisions, what could happen. If they have wrong associations, what could happen. Just what happens when you enter the criminal justice system. And within that is one thing that we dealt with was really dealing with some of the traumas that young people, young boys and young girls face growing up, and then they come into the criminal law system and they're re-traumatized. And so it's we need a system that kind of deals with, you know, antisocial behavior, but doesn't promulgate the traumas that come as a result of one's dealing with the system itself.
Right. And what you're talking about is, I've often heard described as restorative justice.
Yes, that's definitely one model.
Yeah, and you talked about that, I know, in the last episode of the series. You were talking around the topic of restorative justice, and the idea of punitive justice is not the answer.
Correct. And I want to speak to the defunding portion too, if you will. When we hear defunding the police, it isn't a matter of making police in their work irrelevant. But at least in the Black and brown community, is there is nothing to really see kind of tactical units riding up Blue Lab going to a residence in Dorchester with military grade tactical equipment. And so what is the real need for that on a day-to-day basis when it comes to policing? And why is it that type of policing more prevalent in Black and brown communities than it is in white communities? And so when we speak about defunding, it is a reallocation of funds towards more social institutions within those communities that kind of help kind of level the playing field, if you will, not necessarily just taking away funding from the police altogether and just making them inadequate to do what we pay them to do, which is not hide evidence, which is not to falsely imprison, which is not to abuse their authority and all that.
Yeah. I'm trying to funnel through some of these questions. A lot have come in, as you can imagine. Did any part of the press or the media play a constructive role in your and your attorney's success?
Is that to me?
That could be to you, could be to either of your attorneys. Yeah. Whoever wants to take that. Did the
Elise, you want to take that one?
Got to unmute you. I think you can unmute yourself, Jaleese. No?
Maybe you push the space bar.
I'm not able to do it, Ramin, I think. Okay, let's move.
I am asking her to unmute.
Yeah,
So
I am too. It's not working.
she needs to unmute.
You're not able to do it, Jaleese? No. All right. So sorry. Anyone else want to take that?
Sure, I can talk about it. So I do think the press was helpful to us in terms of getting Sean's story out. I think it was helpful to us to have media coverage of what was happening in Sean's case, because I think it sheds light on a subject that was previously done behind closed doors. So I think that the media is important in these types of cases. It's sort of a double-edged sword. Some judges would prefer that the media not be present because it makes things a little bit more difficult in the courtroom. And other judges welcome the media with open arms. And so Judge Ball was somebody who was very respectful of the media. Judge Roach was somebody who was very respectful of the media. And even the SJC now, when they video the oral arguments and release them to the media, I think it helps the public to understand the process, and it helps the public to understand the issues in the fight. And that's, education, of the public and education of the case, I think is always a helpful thing to get more support.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question from someone who is a Needham High School graduate of 2010 and is currently a therapist and clinical social worker inside the San Quentin State Prison, and is proud to have gone to Mitchell Elementary School as well, and is curious to know if there were any social workers or psychologists inside the prison that were able to provide psychological support. Anyone you felt like was on your side? Sean, that's for you. Oh,
Sean's
You're
muting
on-
now.
Okay.
Yes. So to answer that question, there's a culture in prison where it's really the prisoner feels by himself, by his or herself. There are social workers and psychologists that are in prison, but what tends to happen is that you go to talk to a social worker or a psychologist, and next thing you know, what you share with them is being talked about within the prison population, or within the correctional staff. And so that just creates the environment where nobody trusts the people that's supposed to be there to kind of help you along in a healthy space.
Yeah. We have questions about your desire to pursue reparations or income from the Netflix series and any other financial compensation that you're able to pursue at this point. People are interested in that.
Yeah, so we have not, when I say we, like my attorneys and I have not pursued any type of civil litigation against the Boston Police Department or the city of Boston. I do work a 40-hour-a-week job, making maybe just barely over minimum wage, I think it is. And so I'm doing what I can to try to put my life together in a meaningful way. One of the things that Rosemary has told me repeatedly, as well as Mr. Murphy, is that education is the way out. And so that's why it's so important for me to continue my education and try to advance myself. But it's funny because what I was thinking about earlier was like, if I had remained free for all this time, I would be earning a hell of a lot more than what I'm earning now, and so that's the unfortunate piece. But onward and upward.
So one of the drawbacks to filing a civil suit against the city of Boston and against the Boston Police Department is that you then become a target again by them. And there's not a lot that you can do about that. And Sean works within the city of Boston. And so it's a choice that he and his family have to make as to whether or not they want to go down that road. It's a scary thing. I represented another individual who happened to be a kid, an inner city kid who went away for 15 years for a crime he didn't commit, Sean Drumgold. And when he chose to sue the city of Boston, he was arrested 5 times while the suit was pending. And they were all, cases where they claimed he had drugs on him. 2 of the cases we had to try to not guilty verdicts. But there was one case where, because he was arrested so close together, that he ended up spending 30 days in jail on the other side of the bars again. And that, to Sean, scares him to death, the idea of ever being on the other side of those bars again. So it's not that he doesn't want to pursue them. It's that it's a big step for him and his family because he is in harm's way, because they will target him. Because if they can find a way to arrest him, they can say, see, he didn't do this crime, but he's still out there doing crimes, and look at what he's doing. And you don't have the power to stop them from that type of behavior. And it's a scary thing. It's a scary thing to put yourself through, and it's a risk that you and your family have to be willing to take. And so Sean and Jaleesa and I have been discussing the possibility, but right now it's still a scary place for Sean to ever envision himself on the other side of those bars again. And you know, it's a giant leap of faith to believe that they won't come after you, because if you think they'll come after you when you want to get out of prison, you should see what they'll do to you when you're trying to take some money from their department.
Yeah. Yeah, it's no one could blame you for not wanting to go back to pursue anything. If we could sort of end on a more of a high note, I think people are interested in what your plans are for your education, Sean, and many people have commented just on how impressive and fierce and incredible your legal team has been based on what we've seen in the documentary, and whether you had any plans to pursue a law degree or other educational plans.
Yeah, so as Stephanie alluded to, I got my paralegal certificate while I was incarcerated. And by virtue of having to, you know, participate in my defense to the extent that I did, and you know, I definitely had a desire to want to go to law school. That's whether it's law school, whether it's business, which is, you know, I've taken some business class, and some nonprofit practice classes, which I'm kind of doing now. You know, I'm kind of still up in the air, but I do know, and know in certain terms that I definitely want to further my education, and kind of round myself out in that kind of way. And so, you know, I won't rule out law school at this point. I remember having a conversation with Rosemary, asking her, you know, when I graduate, you know, can I get a job in the office?
Yes.
You know, which would be an amazing story, man.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Absolutely. So
I'm seeing Scapiccio and Ellis.
well, McDonough,
there.
Capiccio, McDonough, and Ellis.
Of
Right.
course, McDonough, who I so apologize. I'm not sure what happened with your mute button there, but we certainly want to hear from all of you. So I do want to be respectful of people's time. It is 9 o'clock, and I want to thank you all so much for this amazing conversation and for being here. And thank you all, those of you who have already donated during this call. We appreciate it. I'm going to share the screen after I say goodbye with the donation information again, and we will also be sending that out in an email following up on this meeting. So once again, thank you to everyone, our panelists, my Needham Diversity Initiative colleagues, and everyone who is able to attend tonight. And I think on behalf of everyone, I can say, Sean, you are amazing, and we all wish you the best of luck in whatever you decide to pursue going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.